Like to introduce you now to our executive director of Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung New York office, Andreas Gunther. The floor is yours now, Andreas.
Thank you, Ted. Welcome from New York City. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everywhere. I'm just seeing the people writing where they come from. So it's really, that's really Cape Town, Bangladesh, Oslo. So that's really exciting. So I'm glad to welcome you today in the name of Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung New York office. The Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, for those who are not familiar with us, is an international operating NGO based in Berlin, Germany. We are dedicated to civic education, political research, and our aim is, to put it simply, to foster progressive thinking worldwide. The New York office is the office for the United Nations and and North America, meaning Canada and the US. I know North America is more than that. And we are in our UN work, we are of course closely monitoring and discussing the climate questions. And so this event today is bringing together both of our working fields. The one is the US and the other is the climate issues. Yeah, so we want to comment a bit from an international perspective on the climate summit that President Biden summoned last week. I think hardly any time in history a world leader had a more difficult and an easier job on one policy issue to do. Easier because of what his predecessor has done or not done, and so the expectations or the starting point, the level is very low. So everything he does is a progress. But on the other hand, because of the lapses or that have been left by his predecessor, action is much more urgent now, and a lot has to be done that hasn't been done in the last 4 years. And that's just one aspect of the situation. So, of course, everybody was delighted that President Biden called the summit and that he brought together 40 world leaders. But is this enough? For sure not. And what has to be done? Where do we go from here? That's our question today. And I'm really excited to welcome so much distinguished panelists from many parts of the world. And without further ado, I give the floor back to our amazing host from the Philippines, Ted.
Thank you so much, Andreas. And yeah, that was a very good introduction to this conversation that we're going to have right now. So last week was kind of huge in the US, no? Because President Joe Biden called for a climate summit where he invited around 40 world leaders and other actors. So it's not just the heads of governments who were saying a lot of things about how they can increase the ambition for climate action, but also representatives from different sectors. So he would like to underscore the urgency and the economic benefits of stronger climate action. Now that's very interesting, no? You would think, all right, why do you want to highlight the economic benefits of a stronger climate action? So is the US trying to play catch up? Are these baby steps in the right direction? We'll know later from our panelists, but one thing is sure, the US is back in climate diplomacy. So I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. That we'll also find out from our panelists. So we've invited this amazing panel of experts, both from the Global North and the Global South, who are all actively building power for climate justice. Now, so we're going to have a no-nonsense post-mortem conversation on the Biden Climate Summit. So let me introduce our panelists for tonight, and then we'll dive deep already into the questions that we would be asking them. So first on my list is Dharna Noor. So Dharna is a journalist and video producer with Earther. She has written and she still writes extensively on the climate crisis. So if you're following her on Twitter, she's having this very active um, posts around how big oil is really extending and expanding its reach in all aspects of culture, economy, politics. So maybe we'll hear more about that from Darna later. Next on my list is a colleague from the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung Brussels office. He is a project manager, program manager, Nissim Ashush, who is very much involved in the conversations around the European Green New Deal. So we'll be hearing from Nissim in a little while. And next, it's my honor and my pleasure to be introducing my sister, Dipti Bhatnagar, who is the International Program Coordinator for is actively campaigning for climate justice. So see how many powerful speakers we have in our panel for today. All right. So I'm sure you're very much excited to hear their thoughts. All right. So let's go straight. To all our panelists, what is your number one takeaway from the Biden Climate Summit? So we'd like to hear very much your thoughts around it. So first, I'm going to ask Dipti. All right, Dipti, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's really amazing to be with this amazing group of speakers, and thank you for all of you to join. So big takeaways from the climate summit. It's really important that this is happening. As Tetet was just saying, the signal that the US has sent compared to what it has been sending for the last 4 years is important because climate diplomacy and the importance that we give to the issue of climate change on the international stage is really important. At the same time, the actual commitments that were coming out of the summit last week are really terrible, are really not what we need to be able to stop the climate crisis, or the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So one issue is about fair shares. So the Friends of the Earth US, ActionAid US, and many of the other groups, they released a US fair share statement last week, just in time for the Biden summit. And if we compare what should be the fair share of the US, and when we talk about fair shares, we're talking about historical responsibility. And because climate change is so inherently unjust, it affects most the people who contributed to it the least. It affects those bodies, those communities, those countries which did not create the crisis. And that is what is so unjust. And that's what we need to fight against. When we talk about climate justice, we need to look at historical responsibility. Who are the ones that created the crisis? And they're the ones who need to do the most and the fastest to be able to address the crisis. And of course, the US is the single largest historical polluter. Do not let them tell you, oh, China is the biggest polluter currently, because they do love to say that. The US is the biggest single largest polluter, because we need to look at greenhouse gases cumulatively. The emissions from last year didn't go away. They're very much in the atmosphere, and they're very much causing and worsening the climate crisis. So that's why we look at fair shares, that we demand that the global north countries, the US, Canada, Europe, Japan, Korea, they need to do their fair share of emissions reductions. And I'm really sorry to tell you that what the US announced last year, their nationally determined contribution was 1/4, 25% of what their fair share should be. So the commitment was US will reduce 50 to 52% below 2005 level, based on 2005 levels, will have emissions reductions of 50 to 52%. That's 1/4 of what is actually needed. What is needed is 195% emissions reduction. And what is needed is for the US to really step up and to not only do everything that they can to have emissions reductions within their country, stop dirty energy, stop the false solutions, but at the same time, to come with an attitude of solidarity for the global south, the ones who didn't create the crisis, because the US actually cannot meet its fair share domestically, just by domestic action. It actually needs the help of the countries of the South to be able to meet its fair share. And that's what we're demanding that the US do. And unfortunately, the summit last week, it sent a good signal, but it did not actually produce the numbers that we need to see to be able to stop catastrophic climate change.
Thanks very much, Dipti, for highlighting that. Yes, it's a good signal, but it's not enough. No, certainly it's welcome, but they could have done more. No, they should be doing more. Yeah. So yeah, what do you think about the climate summit?
Yes, thank you, Tetet, and hello to everyone. I am reminded of Stephen Hawking, because Stephen Hawking once wrote, when your expectations are reduced to zero, you really appreciate everything you would have. And that's sort of the theme for the US. So we've had zero expectations from the US in the last 4 years. So I think anything that comes from the US that's an improvement from zero. And if you're generous enough, you would be happy. However, as Deepti has correctly pointed out, on the climate summit, and I hate calling it the Biden climate summit, because that alludes to the power of one person to control the entire solution to climate change. So I'd rather refer to it in its official name, the Leaders Climate Summit. Well, there was a lot going on there, which leads you to think, is this another talk shop? Is this another rhetoric fest? Well, it will be until they do what they promised. And I do have a lot of takeaways from both the summit and the declarations made by the US surrounding the summit. There were some good spots here and there, including, the emphasis on supporting the labor sector, the workers in the transition, green investments, government greening, climate finance, scaling up, transforming energy systems, zero emission. They use the word revolution in a US document to refer to transportation, providing urgent support for vulnerable countries to adapt and build resilience to the climate crisis, and the mention of nature-based solutions. Those are really shining spots there. But if it was a word cloud exercise, that week was a gorgeous couple of days. But word clouds are just that, word clouds, and without substance, they form part of hollow rhetoric that has marked the involvement of the United States in the climate regime for many decades. So my main takeaway, perhaps like many of you and similar to Dipti, is that it was a lot of hype for nothing much. In particular, the pledges that the US had put forward. And I agree with the fair shares argument. If you calculate the contribution of the United States to the climate crisis, you cannot count anything below 100% of something they would do to reverse what the damage they have done. And the calculation from many groups indicate 195% is what is necessary for the US, and that's very far from the 50 to 52%. I don't even know why countries do that when they say 50 to 52%. What's that 2% difference anyway? But if I want to be kinder to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, which I like to do, after all, the Biden-Harris administration seems to be trying its best to push this progressive agenda, and they want this presidency to be defined by the change they believe the world should see, instead of merely being the antithesis to Donald Trump. And I think they're trying their best. It will mean the difference between the Biden-Harris administration being an era for transition versus being an era for transformation. So I do hope that they prove to be a tandem for transformation, and the pronouncements they made on Earth Day fall way too short of that. And I really look forward to this discussion because I have lots to say um, about what needs to be done and what needs to be seen. And your first question is our main takeaway. Again, being generous, I think the new U.S. Nationally determined contribution, as they have announced, it is an attempt to fulfill a little bit of the transformational role. But unfortunately, that 52% cut is far from what science requires and far from what climate justice demands. Well, Biden we realize it's not a Lyndon B. Johnson when he was elected in '64. And I'd like to sympathize with his presidency, having inherited a dysfunctional government, having to weather an insurrection even before he took his oath, receiving a legacy of climate denialism and the fossil fuel industry foothold from his predecessor, a pandemic crisis at that, and winning one of the most polarizing electoral contests in the history of the U.S. So, does he have the mandate to push this progressive agenda? Well, seeing him last night, flanked by Kamala Harris and Speaker Pelosi, leaves you feeling optimistic, not just because it's a historic, unprecedented moment of two women occupying this post and flanking Joe Biden, but also because on its face, Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, you see in that single picture, has control of Congress. But as to how far they can go is the question, and that's always been the big question in the U.S. Participation on the climate crisis conversation, and even in the UN climate negotiations. They've never enjoyed that support from Congress, which has always been at the behest, largely at the behest of industry. They have to deal with what and how much the federal government can achieve. They have to deal with the usual power politics in Washington, and the influence of the fossil fuel industry. So I still see, despite all of the progressive agenda being put forward, again, the main takeaway is it was a lot of hype, but I can still see how there is a big reluctance to abandon the influence of the fossil fuel and the stranglehold of the industry over what is in the interest of the majority of people around the world. Thank you, Tete.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that's a lot of food for thought. No, I'm still processing a lot of the things that you said, but I'm sensing that, okay, coming from a real downer, coming from a real shitty situation, from the previous administration, and then now there are pronouncements that seem to go in the right direction. We are going to hold this administration to account, for all its good intention and nice promises. Otherwise, it's just, more hot air released into the atmosphere. So maybe, okay, we can be a little bit kinder to him, but not entirely letting him off the hook, no? And I think that's what I appreciate from what you said, that, okay, what he announced wasn't even clear to what should be, but at least, sending the right signals. So let me get back to you on that later. Now let me go to Nassim. No, how was the Leaders Summit appreciated or not in Europe?
Oh, thank you very much, Tetet, and thank you for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to be here with such a great panel. So my very first thought, and it's a broad appreciation, is that for the first time in more than a year and the start of the pandemic, the climate question is back at the top of the headlines of mainstream newspaper, on TV, on talk show like this, but mainly mainstream talk show, because I know we haven't been stopping talking about the climate crisis. So the first impulse, I would say, is to be reassured and to think that maybe this is a time where movements, climate justice movements, will be able to occupy again the mediatic and political space, reassessing the extreme necessity to globally rethink our economic system and power relations, and to recognize the responsibility of the global North nations in the climate crisis. So you've the previous speakers have mentioned the historical responsibility from the US and in the climate crisis. And here it's important to also restate the aggregate share of EU countries' emissions historically, with more than 350 billion tons of CO2 since the end of the 18th century, which means 22% of all global historical emissions. Like Dipti said, you should not count what last year emissions, but with a historical view. And even though there is a big discrepancies between those countries in Europe and in the European Union, this should be acknowledged by European leaders, and this should be part of the headlines for sure. So the second thought that comes after looking back at the past year and the start of the pandemic, it's to think about the bumpy road that it has been. So when I remember the calls coming from climate movements and left and progressive actors, but also from a lot of establishments and some quite conservative organizations in Europe and the global north, claiming that things will need to change, that we were leaving a wake-up call on the unsustainability of our economic system, of our global value chains, and the impact it was having on our environment and the human species at whole, globally. And with this came also the generalization of lockdowns that followed the development of the pandemic, with a dramatic decrease in fossil fuel consumption and prices. And for many people, it was a time where the system was shaken up in such a way that things could actually change. But what we have very rapidly witnessed is the extreme lobbying from multinationals and fossil fuel companies to occupy and have a central place in the recovery process. And this is very clear in Europe. I will go to this in more detail later. But with those major corporations profiting largely from public funds deployed to keep the system afloat. So this brings me to the third, my third feeling after having watching the summit, is the fact that we are seeing a welcome initiative with some very broad improvements from the last presidency for sure. But what we are seeing is also a geopolitical and strategic race and a battle between nation and geopolitical actors, but not a concerted plan to globally tackle the climate crisis in a just and fair way. There is a lack of analysis and recognitions of the root of the crisis and the responsibility of Western nations in it. And this is embodied when the European Commissions, with its president Ursula von der Leyen, announces that the climate law was adopted. So during the summit, and a law that set up 55% greenhouse gas reductions compared to 1990 level, presenting it a bit as a trophy. When earlier in the year, the European Parliament had voted for 60% reductions. So we cannot really call this a victory, I would say. The same thought was when during the summit we've seen Bolsonaro using the stage to claim that Brazil would reach emission neutrality by 2050. When civil societies and communities in Brazil are witnessing the unfunding of environmental agencies and the acceleration of the deadly deforestation of the Amazon forest, as well as the criminalization of indigenous population. So the final impression cannot be a totally positive impression, but I would say that this is a start, and it may open windows for movement to keep pressuring policymakers and to start organizing based on those new plans and their gaps. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nissim. A lot of very, very thought-provoking contributions on just the first question. No? So we've pretty much circled the globe. No? We went to Africa, Asia, Europe. Now let's go back to the US. I'd like to ask Dharna. Yeah, when I was watching the broadcast, I kept hearing about climate as the centerpiece of this administration's economic agenda. So what does it mean really for climate to be the centerpiece of an economic agenda?
It's a great question. And as others have said this morning, I think, of course, our expectations have been kind of drastically lowered by the Trump administration. But I want to point out also, this isn't just a step forward in terms of what the Trump administration did, but even if you look back to the Obama administration's international climate pledges, I mean, Biden pledged to get down to half of 2005 levels of carbon emissions by 2030. And that nearly doubles the 10-year US emissions reduction target that the Obama administration set in 2015. So in that case, by the yardstick of recent history, of course, this, these really are historic measures. And on the question of economic opportunity and making this the centerpiece of economic policy, on the one hand, that's a good thing, right? On the one hand, it's very true that if we fail to act on the climate crisis, in the long run, for sure, it will be much, much more expensive than right now enacting the kinds of bold climate policy that we need. However, of course, that also raises some concerns. One, of course, is the concerns about just how drastically low our expectations are. I 100% agree with the fair shares emission reduction targets that Friends of the Earth and Action Aid and others put forth. And I 100% think that those are the kinds of justice-oriented expectations that we need to have. But even as if as Yeb said, we want to be kind to the Biden administration. I'd just like to point out that also an analysis by Climate Action Tracker found that to be really in line with the Paris Agreement's more sort of aspirational target of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which we know feels aspirational, but we also know from that huge report several years ago is what we actually need to avert complete catastrophe. The US would have to target cutting emissions by at least 57 to 63% by 2030. And that doesn't even get into the need for the US to pull the weight of its historical emissions and actually, begin to sort of engage in a sort of reparative climate policy after all of its historical wronging of the global South and other nations. The question of economic opportunity also, I think, raises this question of what the US's sort of approach to dealing with the rest of the world will be. Historically, I think we've seen that with economic opportunity or this focus on innovation, as the US often says, that basically means a prioritization of profit, right? I think that we saw this particularly in some of the people who were invited to speak at the climate summit. I was very heartened to see some climate justice activists like Zia Bastide speak, but also there were folks like Bill Gates and Michael Bloomberg who, essentially have one job themselves. Their responsibility is to their shareholders, not to the US and certainly not to the nations of the global South who have been worst impacted by the climate crisis, despite actually contributing the least. So the question of economic opportunity, I think, will be really, really important to examine as we move through the Biden administration and see, what that actually entails. Of course, the other thing is that, as everyone else has said, pledges themselves do not lower carbon emissions. The question remains what Biden will do now to actually make sure that we do lower emissions. We've gotten some promises from him already, other than just these pledges, making the fleet of vehicles all electric, the federal fleet of vehicles all electric, or shutting down Keystone XL pipeline, shutting down fuel leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. There are these sort of glimmers of hope. But as Nassim said, I think, especially when we've seen how fossil fuels are proving to not even be a safe investment, it seems like really just like tiny drops in the bucket of the huge, huge amount of commitment and real action that we need to see now. I think it's worth noting that it's not just the US that we need more from, of course. I mean, from Brazil on Thursday at the summit, Jair Bolsonaro did something kind of weird. He pledged to double his government's spending to enforce measures to reduce deforestation in the Amazon and stop it altogether by the end of the decade. But then again, 2 days later, he just cut the government's annual environmental budget by 23%. So it's not just the US by any means that we need to see more from. However, as everyone else has said, as the single largest contributor to not only the climate crisis, but also as a nation with such a deep history of colonialism and imperialism, I think that there is so much more that we should be expecting from our leaders here in the US than perhaps anywhere else on Earth, really.
Wow, thanks very much for those thoughts, Darna. No, I'd love to probe deeper, and we'll get to that in a little while. You mentioned earlier, no. Now, this question now is both to Yeb and to Darna, that the climate summit is another attempt at highlighting the urgency of climate action. So, but other world leaders, from the UN Secretary General to Pope Francis, have made similar and perhaps stronger calls to address the climate crisis. How is the US president's initiative different? Well, I can think of one, no? Um, Pope Francis, of course, he's the rock star, has a social justice framing when he called for, meaningful solutions to the climate crisis. Biden, on the other hand, tried to package it as an economically sound approach to economic development. No, so how do you see it influencing the direction or pace of a more ambitious climate action? So I'll ask Yeb first because he's so close with the Pope, who's also a rock star. All right, Yeb, floor is yours.
Thank you, Tetet. Well, first, of course, the Pope is always on a league of his own. I mean, at least Pope Francis. But what makes this different is, and I'm trying to be provocative here. Is it's different primarily because the U.S. is leading it. That's a big change from 30 years that the U.S. has not done anything to lead on climate. We've gone so accustomed to the U.S. lagging on climate, and not just during the Trump years. In the 30-year history, for example, of the climate convention, the U.S. has never hosted a climate summit, has never hosted a conference of the parties, and that is not coincidence. The U.S. has never had a serious stake in the international climate negotiations or any of its outcomes, and as a country has always been at the behest of the fossil fuel industry. And that's why they've never hosted. It's going to be shameful if they do. As the biggest climate polluter, the US has never had the moral ascendancy to host a climate conference. And so this makes it really starkly different that the Biden-Harris tandem is hosting this. And I've seen enough in this process, to know that the US will have to do a great deal of a miracle to convince the world that it's serious about the climate. And again, having said that, many of us have said that maybe it's time for us to give that space for the U.S. to contribute and to come back to the table. But we should all expect a lot more from a government that has repeatedly emphasized climate change as one of the administration's top priorities. Biden mentioned it many times in his campaign on the day of his election victory, at his inauguration, and then one of his first actions was to bring the U.S. back into the Paris Agreement. And again, as the most polluting country in the world, the U.S. must commit to its fair share by reducing absolute emissions, and this can only be free of rhetoric and would be free of hollow rhetoric if it were really going to be translated into action. And I mean, we should not be fooled by and this is what worries me. There was mention of carbon capture and offsets, and when you hear those keywords, carbon capture and offsets, you're talking about the continued proliferation of the fossil fuel industry. You're talking about the continued destruction of forests around the world, and that's what the oil and gas industry is promoting. And everybody should understand that burning of fossil fuels is the leading source of climate change, and there is no offset to that. And that's why we need to see a lot more and hear a lot more from out of gatherings like this than just pledges like this. No, what I want to add is the Paris Agreement, and I've gotten in hot water for saying this many times, but also most anything else that climate diplomacy has ever produced already fall way short of what is required to avert the climate crisis. So if that is the case, anything that merely tries to comply with what diplomacy has come up with is already falling short. What more for commitments or even just mere pledges that are not even that are not even meeting what agreements have set out to achieve. So a lot needs to be done, and And again, we're just happy to see that there is this kind of different wind of change that seems to be at least emanating from the US. But again, my experience in the climate negotiations, the US has always had a delegation that throws monkey wrenches into every negotiation topic, and they're so good at that. And so until the US sends a progressive delegation into the international climate negotiations, that's not going to undermine what their head of state pronounces publicly, then I wouldn't really hold my breath.
Thanks, Yeb. Darna, you mentioned something earlier that struck me, no, na it's not just the US who was making all of these big pronouncements and pledges during the climate summit. So, but going back to my question, how will this US initiative change things or stir things up? Hearing now, what the other heads of states have also announced at the summit.
I think that, Yeb's point, while it's maybe not a very fun one to make, is very important. The metrics that we're even looking at that the US is working with, the Paris Agreement, international climate policy, it's such an obvious point, but that is not binding. I think it's important to remember these commitments are not binding, is already pretty flawed. But in terms of, whether or not this will help the Biden administration sort of gain more legitimacy for the US, forever, I think that many nations have seen that the US has brought corporations with it to the table at climate talks, crafted all this corporate-friendly climate policy, including, as Deb mentioned, things like the use of carbon offsets, carbon capture and other technologies that have been unproven to actually work at scale. And on this front, I don't really know whether or not this will make very much of a change. On the one hand, I think that what we've sort of seen, not only from just the Earth Day Summit, but also from the Biden administration's sort of first 100 days in the White House, is that there has been quite a lot of emphasis placed on upping the supply side of the kinds of renewable energy that we need, right? There's going to be more solar panels, more wind turbines, and not only for the US, but also apparently we're going to be hawking them to the rest of the world. But that's only one part of what we need, right? We also need to get really, really serious about actually winding down the fossil fuel infrastructure that we have here, winding down the huge factory farms, the highways, things like this that are also hugely contributing to the US being the one of the largest emitters right now, the largest emitter in history. So on these fronts, I mean, I didn't hear much from the Biden summit, unfortunately, or you're right, the leaders summit, unfortunately. That really makes me think that we're going to be getting serious about winding down all the infrastructure that we need to. I guess maybe another thing to note is that the US did seem to, while it was pretty light on specifics, did seem to spend quite a bit of its time at the summit sort of pushing other nations to up their commitments. Which, I mean, if it works, I guess that's great, but it's also a bit insulting, right? For the greatest nation, the greatest carbon emitter in history to push other nations to do more. Whether or not it's true that they need to, it's a bit like you need to get your own house in order before you tell others what to do. Of course, that's not to say that it's not true that other nations need to do more. I mean, there was that UN report just a couple of months ago that showed that 75 nations knew NDCs or commitments under the Paris Agreement would only reduce carbon emissions by 1% by 2030. So of course, we need more from the rest of the world as well. But I think that if the US is going to be, taking the charge, she should be doing that by making bigger and bolder commitments and following through on them more than any other nation, not by sort of nudging other nations to do what they think is best without really, without really proving itself first.
Very good points, Darna. No? And I think at this point, we desperately want to be hopeful because of the gravity of the climate crisis. We definitely need urgent but also long-term solutions to the problems. So you mentioned a lot of things already about what the US intends to do. It's so focused on infrastructure, the shift, the transition to clean energy. a lot of the buzzwords I kept on hearing, no, net zero, decarbonization, renewable energy. So what will this mean for the US economy, for the US workers, farmers, but more importantly, what will it mean for the rest of the world? So, Dipti, let's go first to the rest of the world before we go back to the US. What will these pronouncements mean on the ground?
Thanks for that question, Tetet. One of the things that you just mentioned, which is net zero, which Yeb and Dharna both alluded to as well, this whole idea of carbon sequestration, this is extremely dangerous. And of course, it's not the US that is the first one to start talking about it, but we saw a lot of that in the summit last week, and it's just incredibly damaging. I wanted to just show, I just got a copy of this. This is a report that some of us released last October called Not Zero, because net zero is not zero. That really needs to be our mantra, and that's what we need to be pushing back, because net zero is a smokescreen. It's a corporate strategy, as Yeb just now said, for polluters to continue polluting, and not just that, to come to our lands and our forests in the global south to be able to grab those to do carbon sequestration, to be able to offset their emissions. And this is really incredibly damaging, and it's laying out a whole it's going to provoke so much of land grabbing, which is already happening in our countries with the poorest communities. So this is something that was really problematic to see at the Leaders Climate Summit, and this is something all of us really need to educate ourselves on and to push back on, to not accept. Like, why is it that Shell and BP and Chevron, all of them have just conveniently jumped on this bandwagon? Bank of America, even the financial institutions, even University of Pennsylvania, everyone has a net zero target now. And it's very, very convenient that none of these institutions committed to reducing emissions or a zero target, but very conveniently jumped onto a net zero target. And it's because they have an escape hatch, right? They're thinking, okay, we'll just keep doing what we're doing, and we're going to offset it somewhere else. Where are you going to offset it? Whose home are you going to take? Whose land are you going to take? Whose forest are you going to grab to offset it? So this is really about the rest of the world, right? This is about us in Africa, in Asia Pacific, in Latin America. They're going to come for our people's lands to do this, and we really need to be fighting against it. And in the US itself, it's really interesting. In yesterday's State of the Union speech, President Biden talked about carbon farming. And he said, oh, and this is about big ag in the US. This is about the big agricultural houses. And he said, you do this carbon farming, you put these cover crops, and we'll pay you for it. And this is incredibly damaging. We need to be able to understand that this is really about that offsetting strategy that's not going to work in the US, and it's not going to work in the rest of the world. It's going to only dispossess communities further, some of the poorest communities on earth. So this is something we really need to be fighting against. And it's about solidarity, right? It's about solidarity between global North and global South activists, that the climate policies that are put forward in the US, if they really are about climate justice, they cannot worsen the situation for global South communities. And also, I want to say that we want to be in solidarity with what is happening in the US, because as Yeb was saying earlier, this is an incredibly difficult time for climate activists in the US. I really want to acknowledge that the right-wing fascism that of course you're facing, along with other countries, Brazil, India, the UK, in similar situations, the deep political crises that so many of our countries are facing, of course the Philippines as well. Well, I want to stand in solidarity with the activists in the US. What you're trying to do is incredibly difficult right now. And that beautiful image that Yeb painted of President Biden standing with two women behind him, a woman of color, wearing their masks, being responsible. It's amazing what is happening in the US, but it is really difficult what has been happening, George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Movement. So we need to be also in solidarity with our global North colleagues and say, we stand with you when you're fighting against this fascism, and you need to stand with us, and not clap your hands when Biden, just says, okay, we'll do something that's better than what the previous administration did. No, we need to be in constant dialogue with each other, and we need to carry that solidarity all across everything that we do.
Thank you so much, Dipti. I'd like to ask Darna now because I heard during the summit that Biden announced a $2.3 trillion infrastructure package that he says would be integral to achieving the, new emissions targets for the U.S. So what would this massive, I assume, no, what would this massive shift towards renewable energy mean for the American workers, for instance?
Yeah, it's a good question. As I think Yeb said earlier, if this were a word cloud exercise, I think that it would be very clear that we're that we're really winning, right? The talk of job creation and of putting frontline communities at the center. When we talk about climate policy, the use of terms like climate justice would be really heartening if we actually had policies that were sort of meeting the scale of those challenges. With the infrastructure package specifically, I think that one sort of gift that we had last week was that it was not only the week of the Earth Day Summit that the US held, but it was also the week of the Green New Deal. On Capitol Hill, we saw these incredibly bold proposals for a Green New Deal for public housing, a Green New Deal for cities, and others. And those, I think really stand to show just how inadequate Biden's proposals have been. I mean, $2 trillion in infrastructure sounds really, really big until you start thinking about the fact that it's $2 trillion over 2 years. Only half of that is really for anything that we could call green infrastructure. And meanwhile, you have folks like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Representative Jamal Bowman, and others producing these plans to put trillions of dollars into single infrastructure needs. Like the Green New Deal for schools is the perfect example. That's $1 trillion for just building green schools. And as Dipti mentioned, I think that then that sort of makes climate policy not boring and not wonky, right? It's your eyes kind of glaze over it, even if you're not so skeptical of the terms like innovation, net zero. Your eyes start to glaze over it when you start to wonder what's actually in it for you. But I think that we could get so many more people in the US on board for these sorts of policies if we actually put ones forth that would bring good things to people. That's what gets people really excited about climate policy, and to boot would lower far more of our carbon impact, and that would be great for the global South as well. So yes, I mean, I think that the infrastructure proposal is big, and again, not anywhere near the level of big that we need. Dipti, you mentioned the really important issue of carbon markets, carbon offsets, and I just want to sort of call attention to the fact that, I think it was The Intercept that broke the story a couple of years ago that Article 6, which is the part of the Paris Agreement that focuses on, the use of carbon offsets and things like this, particularly for oil. The Intercept broke the story that actually Shell had been in negotiations when the Article 6 was being written. So I think, of course, it's no coincidence, it's no surprise at all that these are the kinds of solutions that would allow continued extraction. And again, don't do anything not only to lower carbon emissions necessarily, but also do nothing to really lower pollution and other sort of local impacts of extraction at the source of producing oil and gas and things like this. So again, it's not really a people first sort of initiative in that sense. And that's what we saw, I think, across the board. The focus is, as we've said, on economic dominance, on making money as we reduce our carbon impact and things like this. Not really about how we promote human flourishing.
All right. Thank you very much for both your contributions. Now I'd like to turn to Nassim. Europe portrays itself as global climate champions, especially with the EU Green New Deal. How do you see this US initiative, Green New Deal for schools, Green New Deal for that, and this and that? How would it compare with that of Europe's? Do you see any similarities? What are the gaps that you see?
Thank you, Ted. It's a very good question, and I think I will jump on just on what Dharna has just said. It's not a people first initiative, and I think there we can find well, the similarity, and the first similarity, and strictly in terms of numbers and greenhouse gas reductions, is that both deals are clearly not doing enough. I will not come back to the trap that the net zero language is setting, because Deepti has just greatly explained it to us. But the EU was the first continent region to come up with this pledge of being net zero in 2050 at the launch of the European Green Deal in December 2020. So with the European Green Deal, the reduction of 55% of climate emissions for 2030 on a 1990 basis, which translates to below 51% on a 2005 basis, is far from being in line with even the Paris Agreement. So in order to contribute to its fair share to the global effort, the EU should achieve at least 65% gross cut emissions by 2030. So this is a first similarity with the pledges and deals. Another major gap, I would say, that is shared by the two proposals and therefore the two leaderships, is the tremendous lack of international perspective and solidarity principles in those plans. And this has been also very well put by Deepti, but it is striking with the EU Green Deal. So the green growth model proposed by the EU will have enormous repercussions on the planet and the global south. Green extractivism pushed to secure the critical raw materials essential to the fabrication of electric cars, wind turbines, and low energy lighting has disastrous impact for the environment. I want to highlight a latest report by Warren Went, a very good report that shows that the extraction of metals and minerals has risen enormously in the last 40 years, from 11 billion tons in 1970 to more than 55 billion tons in 2017, and that the extractive industry accounts for 20% of climate impacts, so with deforestation, droughts, and so on. In the same period, creating disastrous impacts for local communities. Therefore, the lack of coordination with global South countries over those resources and the perpetuation of neo-colonial practices we can assume will be at the core of the growth model proposed by the European Green Deal, even though now we are seeing initiatives with due diligence, but we know this is not enough. This lack of international perspective and fairness and the attitude of solidarity is very clear also when you look at other key policy fields outside of the scope of the European Green Deal. Like the trade sector, and for example, we see that the push coming from the European Union to continue to sign free trade agreements with country or economic regions. Free trade agreements that often involve massive push for agribusiness and trade of natural commodities, and that have a tremendous impacts for climate and local communities. This is the case with the will from the European Commission to sign a free trade agreement with the Mercosur region. The massive imports of livestock, as well as the development of soy production and other monocultures, will push deforestation and displacing local indigenous communities. This is another example of the total offshoring or externalization of emissions and environmental impacts that this kind of plan is proposing in its base, I would say. And we could think that this should be totally incompatible with any really social and climate plan globally. And finally, what I want to say is the last maybe common points, and maybe I'm being a bit harsh, but what we've seen from Europe is that we've acclaimed, or people have received the European Green Deal with a lot of enthusiasm, and we've very fast realized what it meant for especially for the global South and even for population in Europe. And so I want to be maybe a bit overcritical. So there is already we're already prepared. So the final point is the heavy reliance of those plans on market-based solutions and private finance. So we've witnessed at the summit both Biden and Ursula von der Leyen praising and pushing for natural-based solutions. So I think we need precision about what kind of natural-based solutions we are proposing and we are offering. We need to make sure that it's not offsetting carbon emissions in the north, and then we are not increasing the roaring land grabbing that Deepti was talking about. And we have seen in the past that natural-based solutions often equate with the increase of financialization of nature and the offsetting of those emissions. So it is often really more about de-risking private investments and creating new financial instruments and not putting a stop to the greenhouse gas emissions increase. So what we really need to see is actual legislation that will drive down fossil fuel consumption and provide financing of climate mitigation and adaptation for global South countries. And maybe just if I okay, I will stop here.
Don't worry, I can still ask you another point later. But what I'm hearing from all of you is that, you know, the climate summit, the leaders' pronouncements, and even the nature of international climate diplomacy, it's a combination of several things. One, it's about dazzling, you know, a dazzling, nice, fancy package. But when you strip it out of the fancy packaging, you will see false solutions being peddled. You will see recycling their old models under a new name. You know, for instance, I heard the new name for red, which is highly discredited, is leaf. You know, lowering emissions by accelerating forest finance coalition. But essentially, it's about forest conservation and displacing indigenous communities so that they can shift into crops that will supply the export market. You know, it's still precisely what you mentioned. No, how can you talk about climate solutions without looking at the whole architecture? And that is where the interplay of trade agreements, finance agreements, investment deals, they all come into the picture. And it's not a very pretty picture, especially not for communities who are already, you know, suffering the worst impacts of the climate crisis. But one thing also that I hear from all of you is that the US is so back. It is so back in the climate diplomacy stage. So now I ask you all, probably Yeb, because you were a recovering negotiator, no? How will this matter for multilateralism? And also, Dipti, coming from the global south, where the worst impacts of climate injustices are felt. So what is this bleak picture telling us? You know, yeah, Yeb first, the ex-negotiator.
Thank you, Tetet, for reminding me of my past life. Yeah, I always tell people I'm a recovering climate negotiator. That speaks a lot about the profession of being a climate negotiator. And I've seen enough, really. But what this reminds me is the notion of decolonization. You know, when you talk about the U.S. coming back into the fold, you know, what I find leaving a bitter taste in the mouth about this is how suddenly the biggest historical polluter, the U.S. riding its stallion and arriving like a hero to save the day. I don't like that notion, and will save the rest of the world. We need to decolonize as well. The notion of confronting the climate crisis and not rely on the biggest polluters to address this. Of course, they have to be the ones leading the way because they have the resources, and we need to see a mindset of also in terms of addressing, and this really means acknowledging, the U.S. and the EU, the industrialized countries acknowledging the historical responsibility, taking concrete and actual emissions reductions domestically, not in other countries, and recognizing and realizing the fair shares approach to mitigation and ensuring adaptation is happening and meaningful in vulnerable communities, and but also quietly but seriously infusing finance and technology so that developing countries may become the empowered forces they should be, and not mere victims that should be saved. And I would concede that multilateralism has gotten a boost from the summit, from the overall Biden-Harris administration earnest attempt at putting forward a progressive agenda, something that's difficult to do so, but we see them sincerely doing that. However, multilateralism is beyond the MEF. It's beyond the G20 or the 40 countries that attended the summit. It's still pretty much the haves versus the have-nots, and for me, doing and this is just me really, doing a summit that does not include 75% of the countries that also should be at the table. That's an insult to the multilateral process, in fact. And the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is supposed to be the main venue and platform for any international climate discussions and or multilateral conversations. I have never been a fan really of selective multilateralism, Tetet, sorry to say that, because divide and conquer happens in places where you select the participants of a gathering. And the US has been very good at divide and conquer. It's a game they have played for many years, and I suspect they will continue to do so in the multilateral setting. So it's also one thing to hear the US president say something, and another for, again, I said this earlier, for the US delegation to translate that into progressive positions in the Paris Agreement process. And if you look at 40 countries being invited last week out of 197 parties in the UN Convention, that's a paltry number, and that again, that's undermining the spirit of genuine multilateralism and ignoring especially the voices of the global South, which was poorly represented in that summit.
Dipti, your thoughts on this?
Thanks for that. Really agree with every single thing that Yep said just now about multilateralism means we really need to uphold that United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change space since 1992. It's been through many different waves. It's had a lot of problems, but at least all of our countries are sitting there with one vote each. And that's a really important, that continues to be a really important space, and we need to be able to really uphold that and not have this selective multilateralism. I really very much agree with that. In terms of thinking about some of the other implications for our countries of the global South and our peoples of the global South, I wanted to quickly point out some of the climate finance commitments or lack of it that came out of the summit last week. And of course, the US civil society fair shares says that between 2021 and 2030, one of the numbers that the US fair shares framework has supplied to us is $800 billion is what the US needs to be putting down. It's not the entire amount. It's a good faith down payment on what the US actually owes in terms of repayment of the climate debt. And that's between 2021 and 2030, $800 billion. And just to put that in perspective, our friend Brandon Wu at ActionAid US reminded us that the Pentagon's budget for 2022 is $800 billion for 1 year. That's the budget. So it puts into context, right? What is it that we need to be fighting for? We need to demand a huge reduction in military spending, in the tools of war that are literally tearing our peoples apart. And we need to be putting that into repayment of the climate debt and repayment of the ecological debt. There are some other interesting announcements that came out last week, which relate to our peoples in the global South, which is about fossil fuel finance. So the US Development Finance Corporation, they, of course, their announcement was we'll go net zero by 2040. And by now you all know what I think about that demand, because it's net zero. It's all of the problems we mentioned before. But the Exim Bank, the UN Exim Bank, did not have anything to say, and they're the ones who are funding the Mozambique gas project, and they're funding Vaca Muerta in Argentina. So these are things that we need to continue to fight against. Japan talked about reducing their emissions. The target is just absolutely, there's absolutely nothing new they brought to the table. I spoke with our friends at Friends of the Earth Japan, and they say nothing about the fact that they're continuing to support Indramayu coal power plant in Indonesia, where I have been myself a few years ago, the Matarbari coal power plant in Bangladesh, and again, the Mozambique gas project. So these lending arms of the governments that spoke at the summit last week have said absolutely nothing about stopping that fossil fuel finance, that overseas finance, which is going to the most destructive causes. And Ted, it's so interesting that you talked about recycling of old ideas, because I checked with Friends of the Earth Korea, and the statement that the Korean leader made at the summit last week is an absolute replica of a statement already made before about emissions reductions and about stopping fossil fuel finance. There is zero new in that statement. It is literally copy and paste from what they've said before. So it's really problematic what these leaders brought to the table last week. And I wanted to raise one more point, which Nassim raised a really beautiful point about green extractivism and what is happening with all of these commitments, and what could be provoked by things like the Green New Deal is this green extractivism, which is going to come into our countries. And I wanted to show you this. This is the People Power Now Energy Manifesto that we released a few years ago as Friends of the Earth International, and we produced 10 demands for what kind of an energy system do we actually need for people and the planet. And we talk about materials, so what Nassim was saying about where are they going to get the rare earth materials, whose body, whose community in the Congo, or where are they going to rip apart to be able to, go for this sort of green agenda. So when we talk about solidarity, it's really about understanding which policies that are being passed in the global north are going to have these really terrible green extractivism and other impacts in our countries. And that's what we need to be fighting against.
Okay, so at this point, we'd like to invite our friends in the audience. If you have questions or comments that you would like to ask our panelists, please feel free to use the Q&A box. I saw your names and I know most of you, so I'm sure you have a lot of your own views also on everything that's being exchanged in our talk show. But let me read out loud one question that we got from our friend from Bangladesh, Farida. U.S. President Special Envoy John Kerry visited Bangladesh last April 9 to 11 to, quote, work more closely to advance climate resilience and adaptation. Does this visit have more meaning than what we're getting in our news media? So maybe I'm asking the journalist now, Dharna, is there more to it than meets the eye? You're still muted, Dharna. Okay, tech is not cooperating with us. Oh, there's no audio. Is there a way by which we could help you out? You're stuck on mute. Maybe Maria can unmute you. So while we're trying to help Darna out, perhaps any of our panelists would have any thoughts on that. Why is the US seemingly on a climate diplomacy swing? Or could we call it a swing already, or it's just an isolated event? Dipti, you want to share something on that?
Yes, I think it's a really wonderful question, and it's an important question. And of course, there is a symbolic importance to John Kerry going to Bangladesh, which is going to be one of the countries like Mozambique, extremely vulnerable to the ravages of the climate crisis. So I think symbolically, it's really important. But it really reminds me of, and I'll put this in the chat later. So our friends at Demand Climate Justice, they've made this history of US at the climate negotiations over the past 20 plus years. And I was just looking at that, and it reminded me that the US has consistently fought against money for adaptation and for loss and damage. They've not wanted to take any responsibility for those really important pieces of the climate debate. And in 2015, very specifically, when the Paris Agreement was being signed, the US really fought against having any kind of language on adaptation, on finance, on technology and capacity building, which is what our countries in the global south really need to be able to confront this disaster that's unfolding. So while symbolically it is important that John Kerry was there and visiting one of the most affected countries on earth, at the same time, we really need to be able to challenge this history of the US, which has constantly fought against adaptation and money for the poorest countries. So that was my immediate thought when I saw that really, really important question.
So I guess Dharna is ready.
Yes. So sorry about that. Not sure why I lost my audio there. I don't know if I have anything to really add, Dipti. I think I really agree, and I think that it's like pretty much anything from the administration, where the most important thing will be to see what follows the big announcement or the big meeting or the big event, the big pledge. And there are, of course, some really important things that we should look for here. I mean, the United States should, if the United States really wants to help Bangladesh with its transition, it should be not only, committing to massive amounts of green finance for Bangladesh, but also should be, really upping its game in terms of accepting more refugees, more asylum seekers immediately. These are also climate policies on which we have seen some commitment, but I think, like everything else, not anywhere near the level of commitment that we need. And we also should, while we see this happening in Bangladesh, I think that we also need to ensure that this isn't coupled with Kerry going to other nations and encouraging them to, for instance, up their natural gas extraction or to frack more or anything, as we saw him do in Vietnam just 2 years ago. So yes, very, very important meeting. And I think it'll be really important to see what comes next.
Thank you very much for your answers to that question. So actually, I wanted to ask you my own question, no? But I guess my thinking is also aligned with another question here in the Q&A box. Looking forwards, the G7 is not far away. How can grassroots activists in the global north and global south make this an accountability moment for the US and the rich countries on climate justice? So you're all nodding. I'm sensing that you all want to respond to that question. Okay, perhaps let's hear from Nassim, who's deep in thought.
Well, it's a good question, and I think I'm not sure I would have a very good answer to that, or a proper plan, but because it also has sometimes be hard to mobilize around the G7, especially with the climate movements, seeing that looking at this summit as very far away, kind of high representatives, leaders, and I think, as you said, there is a space now after the Earth Day summit to really push for the climate agenda to be at the center of this G7 summit. This is again, well, a space, of course, where there is a selected participants, and where the powerful will speak between the powerful and rich countries will speak between each other without being challenged by global South countries or smaller nations. So we need to make sure that the voices they are there outside to really pressure them to being accountable of what they've been offering some months before. So how can we transmit that to the climate movement, and how can we organize around these dates is something I would be actually curious to hear from my colleagues from the global South, how they see that we could develop a stronger campaigning on that agenda.
Thanks very much, Nisim. Perhaps in the interest of time, we can have that question in everybody else's mind as I read out loud another question that we have here. Could you please give your thoughts on how radical and real climate action can be taken by countries in the global South whose economies strongly depend in the extractive sector, for instance, mining and foreign investments, commonly from the global North? So can we push our agenda, for instance, for coal phase out? And I'm looking at you, Yeb. What is Greenpeace and the other organizations doing to pressure companies on this aspect?
Absolutely. I mean, confronting the stranglehold of the fossil fuel industry on the economies of the global South is an imperative, and we cannot overemphasize the importance of that. But you know that is oversimplistic in the face of so many other things that we need to do. And part of that is really, debunking the global economic world order. That is what's driving the climate crisis, and it's not just one single sector. The challenge we face in all of this is that the enemy really is invisible, because that is how, if you can call it, the neoliberal economic world order makes the forces behind environmental destruction, human displacement. They are invisible. They are beyond the reach even of governments, and they do control governments, and they continue to wreak havoc on people's lives. The oil, coal, gas, cement, industrial farms, all of these industries, forest and land grabbers, extractive industries, they all persist. And what they prefer is that we don't know them, that the people behind these forces are unknown, and that's what makes it so difficult. I'm emphasizing this because if you're looking for something radical, you don't merely look at the energy sector, for instance, but that is important. It's really important in the context of our conversation today that Joe Biden makes sure that that fossil fuels are phased out in the U.S. and in all parts of the world, because most of these companies are domiciled in the United States. So there's just so much more we need to do radically, but that should center on creating another world. This is not the kind of world that that will avert the climate crisis. And the pandemic has taught us a lot of lessons. We need to learn from those lessons, including including the fact that it's the same globalized world that has caused this pandemic, or that has worsened this pandemic, and it's the same globalized economic world order that has caused the climate crisis.
All right. Thank you so much for those. It's a very nice segue into my final question for all of you. No, and I think this is the what $2.3 trillion question in everybody's minds at the moment. So to all of you, where do we go from here? And I'd like to start with Dharna. It's in the US. So where do we go from here?
I think we heard a lot about what we would like to see, the world that we need in the future. But immediately, I guess, one thing that I'll be looking for from the US and other sort of wealthy nations is the WTO meeting happening next week. Of course, that's not specifically focused on the climate crisis. There they'll be discussing the need to waive the intellectual property around the vaccines and allow nations in the global south to use them. But it's, I mean, I've been thinking so much about how this will play out in the warming world, how these same exact fights could happen again with the need to waive clean energy patents, patents for things like wind, solar, and geothermal, and all of these technologies that we'll need. And in fact, this is a demand that many global south nations have been making at international climate negotiations forever, is to waive these patents. And that also is a question of who exactly we're speaking to when crafting climate policy. So again, like Bill Gates, who's been pushing the World Health Organization to keep a tight lock on patents for COVID-19 vaccines, was one of the first people to speak, or was the first person who Vice President Harris introduced on the second day of the Earth Day Summit. So I think one place that we need to go from here is really questioning the motives of these kinds of climate policies. Is the aim here just to, get a handle on molecules and make some already very wealthy people money in the meantime, or is it really to promote policies that will allow all of us to thrive? So for us who are not, making these decisions on the biggest scale, I think that one thing that we can all do is remember that it's not a question of whether or not we finance, green transitions in the global south, or we have green policies here. It's not a question of a global Green New Deal or a national Green New Deal, and the kind of Green New Deal that really does, promote what we all need as ordinary people. We don't need to actually, there's no need to compete between these two things. There's no need to up competitions between different nations. I think we can do so much more with solidarity, and particularly if we remember, how much capital we really have at our disposal here. I mean, as Dipti mentioned, the military budget, of course, that's another whole issue. The Pentagon, the largest industrial polluter of all time, not even considered in international climate talks. But anyway, I digress. If the Pentagon can continue to see its budgets upped every single year, then I think that it's really not unreasonable for all of us to say we need better climate policies for all of us here in the US, and we also need better climate policies for our relations with the rest of the world. There's no need for those two things to be in competition. And I think that in the coming months, that's something that we can all push for together, not only us here in the global north, but also everyone around the world.
And Nissim, how's it going? Where do we go from here, from the European front?
Well, yeah, I would go in the very same direction as Dharna, and saying that we really need to first keep analyzing the proposal that are being made, trying to really disentangle what they mean for the global north, for the impacted communities in the north and in the south. What is their core proposal? And what we also need is to keep the pressure and to keep building coalitions. We see the importance that is to have a worker movement and the climate movement coming together around these issues in the north and in discussions with the south and in solidarity with the south. We will have, as we said, there is already a space for those climate discussions, and it is the COP, and the COP is coming hopefully at the end of this year. in Europe, and we really need before that time to keep on doing the work of bringing the different voices to the table and discussing, because as Yeb was explaining very well, it is not just a question of reorganizing the energy system or trying to fix the transport system. It is to see how all those things are interrelated into the economic world order, and how do we need to create power to definitely change it. So that's my final role, to keep the pressure.
Thank you. And Yeb, where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here? It reminds me that we do have two paths before us, the path of hope and the path of gloom. Why would you choose the path of gloom when the path of hope is what you really want? And there are a lot of things you can do to take the path of hope. And among those is for governments to stay with the Paris Agreement and what it requires, but do more. For cities and local governments to do better than what sovereign countries can do. But for developing countries, especially in the global south, to take adaptation seriously, because the climate emergency will overtake our lives. It will persist and will continue to profoundly affect the most vulnerable and the already marginalized. For the youth to continue exposing the cracks in the system, and for the people's movement to stand steadfast, build solidarity like we have never ever done before, connect the people's movement as strong as we have never done before, and connect the activists in the global north with the global south, and continue confronting the power dynamics that affect the way that the world works. And yes, solidarity has been mentioned. Solidarity is no longer an option. Solidarity among peoples, and I would think solidarity among governments and countries is an imperative if we are to avert the climate crisis. Otherwise, all of the talk we do is just talk, and the climate crisis is a crisis that we will never get out of.
Thank you so much. And last but not the least, Dipti, where do we go from here?
Where we go from here is system change. That's where we need to head. I agree with every single thing that my colleagues have said right here. And that's what we need to push for as Friends of the Earth International and as Justiça Ambiental Friends of the Earth Mozambique, my institutions. We are really trying to fight for system change and call for system change. And that's what we need to be doing. And what Yeb so beautifully says, we have two paths in front of us, and we really need to choose the path that nurtures our people, and we need to choose the path which has the values of solidarity and cooperation and not of profit and greed. I think this is really important. We need to be calling for climate justice and racial justice and gender justice, all of it at the same time, and economic justice and so much more. And we need to interconnect our struggles, and we need to bring, really importantly, the vision of Ubuntu, which comes from these lands in Southern Africa, which is such an important concept to show that I am because we are. Our interconnectedness on this planet, physically, spiritually, and in all ways, is absolutely undeniable. And we need to bring that emotion really into our struggles. And of course, the pandemic has shown us that more than anything else in the world, I am not safe unless everybody is safe. So we really need to bring this value system of being connected and really pushing for system change and pushing for a world where everyone's living in dignity and in peace and with justice. That's where we head. It's a big task, but that's the direction we need to be moving.
So the path to hope is not the path that has been paved before us by the Biden Climate Summit. The true path of hope, therefore, lies in system change, because only system change can bring us to a just and transformative recovery. Now, not from the climate crisis, from the economic crisis, social crisis, and the political crisis. And for that, I like what you have said, no? Fight for solidarity like your lives depended on it, because it does. Our survival depends on our solidarity as a people. So with that, I really, really thank our panelists, Darna, Nassim, Kiev, and of course, Dipti. Thank you so much for this very, very interesting exchange. We learned so much from all of you, and we hope that we could invite you again for another conversation similar to this and more. And we also like to thank our friends who have joined us today. Thank you so much, and we hope that you also found this exchange very meaningful, uplifting, energizing, and triggering, the fire inside us, because we do need to keep the fire burning for climate justice, social justice, gender justice, racial justice. So with that, thank you all, and have a good day.